Captain Dale Morrison had 22 years of experience flying for major airlines, a spotless safety record, and an ego to match both. When he walked into the pre-flight briefing at San Francisco International Airport and saw his assigned co-pilot, he didn't bother hiding his disappointment. Rafael Santos, a Filipino first officer recently transferred from Philippine Airlines, stood quietly reviewing weather charts with an intensity that Morrison found almost amusing. "You're the guy from Manila, right?" Morrison said, not waiting for an answer. "Listen, we've got some weather between here and Tokyo, but nothing a real pilot can't handle. Just follow my lead and try not to touch anything important." Rafa nodded politely, accustomed to this treatment. He'd heard it before, the assumption that flying between tropical islands somehow didn't prepare you for real aviation. What Morrison didn't know was that Rafa had logged over 8,000 hours flying through some of the most unpredictable weather on Earth, navigating typhoons that would ground flights anywhere else in the world, and landing on island runways where margins for error were measured in feet, not miles. As they boarded the Boeing 777 with 287 passengers and 14 crew members, Morrison was already planning his post-flight report, recommending Rafa be assigned to domestic routes only. "International transpacific flights require a different caliber of pilot," he'd write. The first 4 hours were textbook smooth. Morrison spent most of it telling stories about his career to the flight attendants, barely acknowledging Rafa's presence, except to occasionally grunt approval at routine callouts. Rafa monitored systems, ran checks, and studied the weather radar with growing concern. A massive storm system was developing ahead of schedule, exactly where their flight path would take them in about 90 minutes. "Captain, I'm seeing some significant development on the radar. That cell wasn't supposed to intensify until we were past it," Rafa said carefully. Morrison glanced at the screen dismissively. "It's just Pacific weather. Bumpy for 10 minutes, then clear. I've flown through worse." But Rafa's trained eye, honed by years of watching typhoon patterns develop in real time over the Philippine seesaw, something Morrison's textbook training didn't recognize. The cell wasn't just intensifying, it was rotating and spreading in a pattern he'd seen dozens of times before. This wasn't going to be bumpy for 10 minutes. This was going to be catastrophic. 30 minutes later, the first officer's prediction proved horrifyingly accurate. They hit the storm wall at 37,000 feet, going 540 miles per hour. The plane dropped 2,000 feet in seconds. Screams erupted from the cabin. Overhead bins flew open. The aircraft shook so violently that Morrison's coffee cup shattered against the windscreen. "What the hell?" Morrison shouted, gripping the controls as another violent drop slammed them downward. Lightning struck so close, the cockpit lit up like a camera flash. The radar was now completely red. They were in the heart of something far worse than forecast. Morrison's training took over, but it was textbook American aviation training, designed for predictable weather patterns and modern radar systems. That gave you time to navigate around problems. He tried climbing above it. The turbulence got worse. He tried descending below it. They hit wind shear that nearly inverted the aircraft. Alarms were screaming. The autopilot disengaged. Air traffic control was barely audible through the static. And Morrison, for the first time in his 22-year career, felt genuine fear. "Captain, request permission to take controls," Rafa said calmly, his voice steady despite the chaos. "No, I've got this," Morrison insisted, but his hands were shaking as another massive jolt sent them sideways. The plane was being tossed like a toy. In the cabin, passengers were crying, praying, some writing goodbye messages on their phones. The senior flight attendant's emergency call came through. "Cockpit, we have injuries back here. People are terrified. Can you get us out of this?" Morrison tried another maneuver from his training manual. It made things worse. The structural stress alarms started blaring. They were approaching the aircraft's limits. "Captain, please," Rafa said more urgently. "I've flown through Typhoon Haiyan, Typhoon Mangkhut, storms that don't even have names. I know this pattern. I can get us through, but you have to trust me. Now." Morrison looked at his co-pilot, really looked at him for the first time. The Filipino pilot wasn't panicking. His eyes were scanning instruments with practiced precision, his hands ready, his entire demeanor radiating a confidence that came from experience. Morrison suddenly realized he didn't have in that split second of humility born from terror. Morrison made the hardest decision of his career. "Aircraft is yours," Morrison said, releasing the controls. Rafa's hands moved with immediate certainty, but what he did next made no sense to Morrison's textbook training. Instead of trying to climb or descend, Rafa did something that seemed insane. He turned into the rotation of the storm at a specific angle, reduced power to what seemed like dangerously low thrust, and dropped the nose slightly. "What are you doing? You're flying us deeper into it," Morrison shouted. "Trust me, Captain. In the Philippines, we call this riding the calabor, the water buffalo. You don't fight it, you move with it." Rafa wasn't fighting the storm using instruments and calculations. He was feeling it, treating the turbulence patterns through the controls, like a surfer reading a wave. Using techniques passed down from Filipino bush pilots who'd been flying through typhoons since before sophisticated weather radar existed. He found the calm corridor inside the chaos, a narrow channel where the wind patterns created a relatively stable path. It was invisible to radar, unmapped by meteorology, but Reland Rafa had learned to find it by instinct and experience. The violent shaking began to ease. The drops became less severe. Within 3 minutes, they broke through into smoother air. Within 5, they were clear of the system entirely, the storm receding behind them like a bad dream. The cockpit alarms fell silent. Morrison stared at his instruments in disbelief, then at Rafa, who was calmly adjusting their course back to the flight plan as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The radio crackled. "Flight 227, Tokyo Control. We show you clear of the weather. Are you okay up there? We lost your transponder signal for a few minutes. Tokyo Control, Flight 227, we're fine. Just took the scenic route." Rafa responded with a slight smile. In the cabin, passengers were hugging each other, crying with relief, some even laughing with the giddy release of surviving something terrifying. The senior flight attendant called up, "Cockpit, whatever you just did, thank you." People back here thought they were going to die. Morrison sat in silence for a long moment, his hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. Then he did something he rarely did. He admitted he'd been wrong. "That was Rafa. I don't know what you just did, but you saved this aircraft. You saved everyone on board. I've never seen flying like that." Rafa looked over at his captain. "In the Philippines, Captain, we don't have the luxury of avoiding weather. Typhoons don't follow forecasts. Runways are short. Equipment is old. We learn to fly with what we have, through whatever comes. My instructor used to say, the textbook tells you what should work. Experience tells you what actually works. I learned from pilots who flew through storms when they had no choice, no radar, no instruments that worked, just instinct and knowledge passed down." Morrison nodded slowly, his arrogance completely deflated. "When we land in Tokyo, I'm filing a report, but not the one I was planning to write. The landing was perfect, smooth, centered, textbook. As passengers deplaned, many stopped to thank the crew, unaware that the Filipino co-pilot they'd barely noticed boarding had just saved their lives, using skills learned flying puddle jumpers through tropical storms. In the crew room, Morrison pulled Rafa aside. "I judged you before you even sat down. I'm sorry, that won't happen again." Rafa smiled. "Captain, in Manila we have a saying, ang hindi, maronon, lumingan, sa penanggalingan, a hindi makararating, sa perunan. It means if you don't know where you came from, you'll never get where you're going. My skills came from flying old planes through impossible weather because we had no choice. Your skills came from excellent training in excellent conditions. Both are valuable. Today, mine just happened to be what we needed." The story spread through the airline within days. Pilots sought out Rafa, asking him to teach them the storm navigation techniques he'd learned. Training departments wanted to document his methods, and Morrison became his most vocal advocate. A year later, when Boeing developed new storm navigation protocols for their pilots, they flew a team to Manila to study how Filipino pilots had been successfully navigating severe weather for decades with minimal technology. The techniques Rafa used that day, reading turbulence patterns, finding stable corridors inside storms, working with weather instead of fighting it, were integrated into advanced pilot training worldwide. And Captain Dale Morrison, now retired, tells anyone who'll listen, "The best pilot I ever flew with wasn't from my flight school. He was from Manila, and he taught me that sometimes the most sophisticated flying looks the simplest when you actually know what you're doing." Rafa still flies, now as a captain himself, training new pilots in techniques that combine modern technology with traditional Filipino aviation wisdom. And every time he guides a plane through a storm that makes others nervous, He thinks of his first instructors in the Philippines who taught him that sometimes survival isn't about having the best equipment, it's about having the deepest understanding of what you're facing. The Filipino pilot who couldn't handle storms just became the one everyone wants in the cockpit when the weather turns deadly.